Hi, and welcome to your annual civil rights training. This is through the USDA, through the food programs TIF App and CSFP. TIF App is the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and CSFP is the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, otherwise known as our Senior Box Program. TIF App is where we get the USDA funding for our pantries and our hot meals, our kids' cafes, summer feeding programs, and any other program that receives federal funding for emergency feeding. CSFP is more strict for our Senior Box program only. Now before we get going, these are the questions you might be asking yourself. Why do I need training? What are the key topics that I really need to know? Where did civil rights concepts come from? What if I run a program through a faith-based organization? What exactly is discrimination? And what about the people with limited access to my food program, such as those with disabilities or limited English proficiency? And finally, what happens if somebody wants to file a complaint? We're going to answer all of those questions, but first, why do I need civil rights training? This is required annual training required by the USDA. Again, because your program receives TIF App and/or CSFP funding through Second Harvest in the means of food, you do have to do the civil rights training every single year. First, we're going to talk about those take-home messages I just mentioned. First of all, treat everyone equally, with the respect and dignity that every single person deserves. You want to make sure you're training your frontline staff and volunteers annually with civil rights, and really make sure that you are documenting that training. When we do our on-site monitor visits every year or every 2 years with your program, depending on what type of program you run, that's something that we're going to make sure you're doing, is training your volunteers. Third, making sure that you have proper postings prominently displayed at your food programs. Any of our programs, whether you receive TIF App or CSFP funding, you're required to post the And Justice for All poster, the 11x17 green poster, that you should already have. Any of our faith-based organizations should have the applicant written notice of applicant and recipient rights posted in your common area. Any of our pantries are required to have the income eligibility guidelines posted as well. Next, making sure that you're documenting any situation where you have refused service to a guest. We also would ask that you document any sort of incident where there's a pretty big conflict at hand, even if you do end up serving that person. Making sure you document these incidents is required by Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, or ODJFS. Lastly, making sure you're including the non-discrimination statement in any of your marketing materials, flyers, social media accounts, or your website, and any other public-facing documentation mentioning your food program. At a minimum, if the entire non-discrimination statement does not fit on your written materials, you must at least have the sentence, "This institution is an equal opportunity provider." So I've mentioned TIF App and CSFP a little bit already. What is TIF App? The Emergency Food Assistance Program. It helps supplement the diets of low-income Americans, including children, adults, and seniors, at no cost to our food pantries for ordering TIF App funding. The USDA makes these foods available. Those items flow through Second Harvest and onto our programs for emergency feeding. A lot of the times these programs will include our pantries, our hot meal programs, our kids' cafes, and summer feeding. What is CSFP? Again, that stands for Commodity Supplemental Food Program, or what we call our Senior Box Program. This program is specifically designed for our seniors who are 60 years or older. Now, while TIF App has an income eligibility guideline of 200% of the federal poverty guideline, Our senior box program is a little bit more strict, where it's at 130% of the federal poverty line. So it's a little bit more strict than our pantries or our hot meal programs. In either case, where you are receiving TIF App funding or CSFP funding, you are required to receive this training. So what exactly are civil rights? Civil rights are the non-political rights of a citizen, the rights of personal liberty guaranteed to U.S. citizens by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and by acts of Congress. And we're going to talk about those acts of Congress in just a few short minutes. The goals of civil rights training is, like I said, making sure that everybody is treated equally. This goes for all applicants and beneficiaries under the law. We want to make sure we're providing knowledge of rights and responsibilities to not only recipients, but also program staff and volunteers. And of course, making sure that we are eliminating legal barriers that prevent or deter people from receiving benefits. And as always, providing a baseline of dignity and respect for all. Here are some of your responsibilities as our partners with Second Harvest. Like I mentioned before, please make sure you're training your staff and volunteers in civil rights requirements every single year, just like Second Harvest trains you. And maintaining that proper documentation, which we'll show you in just a second. You also need to comply with civil rights laws, regulations, and requirements that you're learning throughout this presentation. You need to make sure you're taking reasonable steps to ensure adequate access to your programs and activities by persons with disabilities and/or limited English proficiency. Making sure that USDA funds do not support any inherently religious activities. This might be, let's say you run a hot meal program and you say that the food that you get from Second Harvest is going to be used to prepare a meal for only the people who went to church. That's something that we can't have happen because that meal is then supporting an inherently religious activity. Lastly, you need to provide public notification and follow-up that may include the following: compliance reviews, complaint process, accommodating persons with disabilities, resolving conflict, and making sure you're practicing good customer service. When you train your staff and volunteers who are working with guests and community members directly, these are the different topics that need to be covered, very similar to what we're covering today, and it's listed on the documentation that you should be keeping on file for training your staff and volunteers. This is the checklist I just mentioned. You would sit down with each of your volunteers or staff members. Again, this is your frontline staff and volunteers who are going to be interacting directly with your community members. If you have a volunteer, and that volunteer's responsibility is strictly to come help you unload your pickup order and stock your shelves, if that person has no interaction with your community members, you would not need to train them in civil rights every year. Now, if their responsibility changes and they do start working with community members, that would be the time to train them in civil rights. But this is the easiest way that you can train your volunteers, or you could have them sit down and watch this video. Each person should receive this page, and they would initial each box, and then on the back of the page, print, sign, and date the document. If you happen to do this training in a group setting, that's perfectly fine. What we need to have is a piece of paper with each volunteer's printed name so it's legible, their signature, the date that they received training, and preferably the person who trained them. You would then attach that list of signatures with this checklist so that we know when we come to check your documentation what sort of material you used to train your volunteers. Now you might be wondering, who exactly is covered under civil rights? Each federal program has its own list of federally protected classes for that specific federal program. Under USDA, through TIF App and CSFP, these are the 6 protected classes under those programs: race, color, national origin, age, sex, and disability. Again, these are the federally protected classes through TIF App and CSFP only. Now here are those acts of Congress that I mentioned very early in the presentation. So when you think, where did those 6 protected classes come from? This is where it comes from. You have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which involved race, color, and national origin. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 involved sex, and that's not only male versus female, etc. That also does cover sexual harassment. There's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which involved disability, along with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then there's the Age Discrimination Act of 1975, of course covering age. And lastly, the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987, which again involved race, color, and national origin. Now, because Second Harvest is a member of Feeding America, and of course we don't want to discriminate against anybody for any reason at all, in addition to those 6 federally protected classes, you also may not discriminate against anyone on the basis of marital status, family status, parental status, religion, sexual orientation, genetic information, political beliefs, reprisal, or income. So going back to that question of what if I run my program through a faith-based organization, which in most of the case is through a church. What you can do as a faith-based organization, as I'm sure you know already, is that you can receive federal funds through TIF App and or CSFP in order to operate emergency feeding programs. You can also use your space in your church or in your faith-based facility without having to remove any sort of religious artwork or symbols. What faith-based organizations cannot do is discriminate against individuals on the basis of religion or religious beliefs. You also can't use those USDA funds or product from Second Harvest for religious activities. You may not distribute religious information to guests, although you can have religious information available. It just has to be that community member's choice to take it or not. What you can't do is put any sort of religious information in bags or boxes going out the door with your community members at the food program. You may not make guests participate in a religious activity to receive assistance. So this is like saying, in order to come to our hot meal, you have to come to church first. Or in order to come to our pantry, we're going to sit through a prayer service. Those are things we can't do. What you can do is offer some sort of religious activity in a separate area from your food program. You also may not proselytize or preach during your food program. So that means no preaching or any sort of teaching of your religious organization while people are receiving services through your food program or while they're waiting in line. Now, to answer another specific question that we get a lot is if somebody asks to pray with me, is that okay? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Really, the important thing with our faith-based organizations interacting with community members is making sure that that faith-based activity is the community member's choice and that it's not forced upon our recipients of your food program. Again, an example here of what we can't do is, as a part of a meal service, a soup kitchen requires a prayer before the meal. Like I mentioned a little bit before, this posting needs to be available at your food program if you're a faith-based organization. It's called our Written Notice of Applicant and Recipient Rights, which pretty much lays out the rights of your community members to not have any sort of religious activity or materials forced upon them. For our pantries, our hot meals, and including shelters or a kids' cafe, You would put your partner charity name, a contact at your church or your organization, the church or organization's phone number. I wouldn't recommend putting a cell phone number just because this is going to be available to the public, and a generic email address for your organization if you have one. Now for our hot meals, shelters, and pantries, this document is okay to post at your programs. For our senior box program, this document must be individually distributed at the time of application. So anytime one of your seniors comes in for a senior box, this needs to be included within their senior box application. Going along with the applicant and recipient rights from faith-based organizations, this is a referral sheet. You only want to use this referral sheet if somebody comes to you and specifically asks to not be served at your faith-based organization. You don't want to use this if somebody is simply coming to say that they would rather go somewhere across town that's closer to home. This is very important documentation. If somebody comes to your organization, let's say you're a Christian church, and they say, I don't want to be served by a Christian church. I would rather be served by someone non-denominational or somebody who is not faith-based at all. What you want to do is fill out this sheet with them. The easiest thing is to refer them to Second Harvest. You want to make sure you keep a copy of this documentation. In the case that that person could go back and file a complaint, perhaps saying that your church refused to serve them because of your faith-based nature, you have documentation saying otherwise, that they actually requested to not be served by you. This is very important to keep documented. Digging deeper into civil rights and what is discrimination. The definition of discrimination is different treatment which makes a distinction of one person or a group of persons from others, either intentionally by neglect or by the actions or lack of actions based on protected classes. While that might seem a little bit convoluted, we're going to describe the 3 types of discrimination. This helps you understand a little bit more about discrimination. The 3 types are disparate treatment, disparate impact, and retaliation. Disparate treatment is a pretty clear-cut concept. It is intentionally treating someone differently because they belong to a protected class. For example, a pantry doesn't serve anyone who speaks a language other than English. This is discrimination against national origin, and it's a pretty clear policy. Disparate impact is a little bit more fuzzy. It's unfair practices and procedures that are unintentional. In many cases, organizations who are practicing discrimination through disparate impact, their intentions are actually supposed to be good for people. For example, in order to ensure that there are interpreters available, a food pantry wants to mandate that all Russian-speaking participants be served on the second Friday of each month. What this pantry is trying to do is provide a resource to be able to work with their Russian-speaking participants. What they're actually doing, though, is discriminating against those Russian-speaking participants by first of all denying them access to the same sort of food access that other people have who don't speak Russian, and they would be denying non-Russian speaking participants to that second Friday distribution. The last type of discrimination is retaliation, which is negative treatment of an individual due to their prior civil rights activity, or even just for cooperating with an investigation. An example of this is where a recipient receiving services has recently filed a discrimination claim against the program. Once that person shows up to the program says, sorry, you filed a complaint, so you can't get services here anymore. We absolutely cannot do that. If you know somebody has filed a complaint or has participated in an investigation, you still have to serve them just like every other community member equally. Like I mentioned at the beginning, what happens if I have somebody who has limited access to my program, whether it is a matter of someone with a disability or someone with limited English proficiency? When it comes to a disability, and more specifically physical access, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Perhaps you could move your distribution or your meal to another part of the building that is handicap accessible. You could also, for our pantries, have an authorized representative, or what we call a proxy, to pick up groceries for somebody else in need. So if somebody is homebound, they can send a friend, a family member, or a neighbor to come get their groceries for them. If your program is able to accommodate this way, you would also maybe think about making home deliveries. Not everybody is able to do that, and that's completely fine. As long as you are accommodating in some sort of way, that's really what we're looking for here. Lastly, the most important thing is perhaps talk to that person, see what would work for them. Maybe they don't need a home delivery, but if you could make an exception and maybe if you distribute on a Saturday, maybe they're available on Sunday and you could accommodate that way. But really the point is talk to that person and see what is mutually beneficial to serve that person between you and your program. The other type of limited access that we see is individuals with limited English proficiency. These individuals typically don't speak English as their primary language, and they have a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. You have to make every effort to be able to serve these individuals. What you can't do is make these individuals bring their own interpreter, and you also shouldn't really use children to help interpret. The good news is we have resources to help you. The USDA provides an I Speak statement, which is essentially a list of different languages. So hopefully if somebody comes to your program and you don't know what language they speak, you would pull out this sheet, have them point to the language they speak, and at least that gets you a starting point. From there, we have a next resource. The Affordable Languages Services. What this does is it provides free interpretation to someone that you can't communicate with if they don't speak English. You would simply call the 1-800 number listed on this sheet, dial in our access code to say that you're with Second Harvest Food Bank, and this is a free service. So this organization will find somebody to interpret for you. This is our way of accommodating for those individuals with limited English proficiency. If you reach back in your memory, I did mention public notification as something that we need to cover today. There are 3 elements of public notification. First of all, program availability. This is important because all of our programs which receive TIF App and CSFP funding must be open to the public. Second Harvest does this for you in a way by having your hours posted on our website. Please let us know if your hours do change or if you notice that our website is not updated, and let us know what we should change it to. The other part of program availability should be covered by your organization. Somewhere along the way you should have something posted at your location with what your hours are for your food program. Second and third is a non-discrimination statement and complaint information. Luckily, you don't have to do anything extra for these items because both of those topics are covered in the And Justice for All poster, which you should have posted at your location already. This is the infamous non-discrimination statement that I've been mentioning all along. Like I said, it's included in your And Justice for All poster, and it really should be included in any sort of marketing or advertising or flyers that you have mentioning your food program. This is super easy to do on your website or your social media account in the About Me section. You can paste this whole non-discrimination statement, or you can find the link itself at usda.gov. Like I mentioned, if you can't fit this whole entire statement, you really need to have the sentence, "This institution is an equal opportunity provider," in any sort of written material about your food program. Again, this is another text reminder that all marketing materials, flyers, pictures, any sort of advertisements about your food program must have this non-discrimination statement. Going back to that question, what if somebody wants to file a complaint? As a recipient of TIF App and SHFBNCO funding, you are required to have some sort of complaint process in place. That can simply be having this complaint form on file and working with that individual to fill out the complaint form. Now, chances are, if somebody wants to file a complaint against you, they're not likely to come directly to you or to your program in order to do that. They're probably going to go straight to the USDA, talk to Second Harvest, or go to the ODJFS. What's very, very important is making sure that your recipients and applicants know that they have the right to file a complaint, which is covered in your And Justice for All poster. They need to know how to file a complaint, which is also covered in your And Justice for All poster. And like I said, making sure that you have internal complaint procedures in case somebody comes to you wanting to file a complaint. Data collection and reporting is done in kind of an uneventful way for our food programs. First of all, it is not meant to discriminate. So when we collect data and when we report information, it is in a non-discriminatory way. We want to make sure that we're providing information in different formats and languages to meet all levels of ability. If your organization serves a lot of Spanish-speaking individuals, which is common for our 4 counties, you want to make sure that you have Spanish materials available when possible. Now, when we talk about outreach, that is reaching underserved groups. Well, that's a little bit out of the realm of possibility or realistic measures for our food programs. If you had the information to say, for example, you know that you serve 70% of your community members are female and 30% are male, you would want to reach out to more males so that you could get that down to a 50-50 ratio as close as possible. Again, talking about data collection and reporting, all data must be collected and kept secure and confidential. Through Pantry Track, this is a great way to get the electronic signatures, making things go a little bit smoother, but then also having that very secure and confidential way of keeping records. If you're using paper forms for either Pantry or your Senior Box program, you really need to have a way to have that information secured and locked, and if at the end of the 5-year period of record retention, you're ready to get rid of information, you should shred any information if it has somebody's address on it. For our Senior Box program, we do require information every single year about participants' race, ethnicity, and handicap status. You'll get an email from Second Harvest so that we can collect that data and submit it to the state. Customer service is so important when it comes to our food programs. Long and the short of it is, treat others the way that you would like to be treated. This is the golden rule. We really want to focus on customer service to make every single experience at any of our food programs almost like somebody is going to the grocery store. We don't want to make people feel ashamed or have that kind of negative experience at any of our food programs. The same goes for our hot meals and shelters. As much as you can at your program, we really strive to make that experience more like a restaurant experience rather than a handout. Now, some of our programs experience conflict on a fairly regular basis. This can happen a lot when you have long lines at your program. A couple of tips. Remain calm with your posture and tone. Don't look or sound aggressive. Try to explain your understanding of the situation. Talking to somebody who is aggressive or seems like they might threaten or injure somebody, you really want to try and calm them down as much as possible and understand what they're going through. Third, get help if you need it. Train your volunteers and your staff to come get your main coordinator so that that person doesn't have to deal with the situation if they don't feel comfortable. If needed, call the police. You should also have a written and posted policy for dealing with unacceptable behavior and conflicts. In your packet of information, you have the right to refuse service policy. We do recommend that you have this policy posted, or at least available and understood by your staff and volunteers. This gives your staff and volunteers the agency to be able to deal with somebody who is causing a conflict or is acting inappropriately. You also have this to rely on. If you do need to refuse service, you can show the community member your policy of why you're refusing them service based on their behavior. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we really need to document any sort of refusal of service, or I would also recommend documenting severe conflicts, even if you do end up serving that person. This is the sheet that is provided to you. You don't have to use this exact documentation, but we should have the guest's name if you know it, their signature if they're willing to give it to you, or you can check the refuse signature box. You should have the volunteer sign, whoever dealt with the situation, and have your director sign just so that the main person running your program is aware of the situation. Anything that we're asking you to document in today's training, whether it is your right to refuse service incident report, your CSFP applications, your TIF App applications if you have anything in paper, your civil rights training records, any sort of documentation that you are asked to keep for Second Harvest must be kept for 5 years plus the current year. As we close today's training, I please ask you to fill out the Civil Rights Training Acknowledgement form. This tells me that you have attended this training, you have paid attention, you understand the concepts of all of those items listed, and that you have been trained for this calendar year. Please fill out the name, signature, your partner charity name, the date, and your program number. If you're not sure what your program number is, that's okay. I can fill it in for you when I get it returned to me. As you can see, please submit the Civil Rights Training Acknowledgement to Sarah Haran at my email address listed there. Once again, thank you so much for your time today to sit through our civil rights training. Again, this does need to be done every single year because you receive TIF App and/or CSFP funding through Second Harvest Food Bank of North Central Ohio. If you do have questions or concerns about the topics in today's training, feel free to call us at 440-960-2265. You can ask for Sarah, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Or we do have a civil rights resource page at the website listed here. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful civil rights training day.